prescient PhD was done in Sussex by Roger Berry, who used an input-output model of the Indian economy. And he addressed this issue. What happens if we redistribute income? Do we create jobs? And what he found was that it's true that poor people's consumption baskets had more labor-intensive goods than rich people. But at the margin, rich people consume services, which is labor-intensive. At the margin, poor people want manufacturers, which is capital-intensive. So Berry's argument was counterintuitive, at least in the 1970s, based on, I think, a 37-sector input-output model, with all the defects of aggregative input-output models, and it would make a difference. But I don't believe it. I don't believe it. And I think countries which are not completely open and which have more equal patterns of income distribution will experience this dynamic more intensely. So, I'm finishing. I've told you a story about the developing world in general, about Africa in particular, which is my research area. But actually, I think the problems of marginalization, of unemployment, of extreme poverty are beginning to be manifested in an increasing pace in the rich countries as well. And I think many of the things which I'm talking about might also have application to rich countries.
Well, thank you very much, Rafi. As always, enlightening and engrossing. I was in Beijing just a few weeks ago, and actually it was the first time I had been in Beijing for about 15 or 16 years. And for me, the most telling innovation that I saw was that they had introduced bicycle lanes. 16 years ago, they didn't need bicycle lanes. There weren't any cars, but now it was bicycle lanes. So that was really, for me, an eye-opener. We have time for questions. If I can... Okay, and those in the back, please speak up.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. I would like to pick on the idea that Chinese products are low quality. And if we look back to the Japanese quality of products in the early days when they entered the American market, it was very low quality as well. But 15 years later, they have improved considerably, 20 years later. And nowadays, they say that the Japanese quality is the benchmark. So in 20 years from now, do you think that the Chinese will have upgraded their quality of products? And if so, who's going to supply the poor market segments?
Howie, this often is a big issue. Maybe there are other people who want to contribute or discuss before I come back on that one.
Okay, can we have a few? Ed.
Well, it's a related question about Japan. Looking back as to how Japan was viewed at a particular point in time as well. Almost all of your arguments are arguments that we would have made in the 80s with regard to Japan. It didn't turn out quite that way. In particular, the idea was, well, Germany and Switzerland, for that matter, would be greatly disadvantaged by the growth of the capital market, the capital producing capabilities of Japan. And what's more, Japan was producing things that were appropriate for developing countries, and most of the arguments, so that I sort of come out with a very mercantilist message from what you're saying. Okay, that at the end of the day, this is about a zero-sum game in which the rise in the share of India and China in terms of the total income of the world is bad news for the developed world. I'm not so sure that's true.
Anybody on?
If it's on the quality one, otherwise...
Oh, no.
Okay. Can I
Please
take the quality and then go into what's different about China? Because your points span both. Who else has got an iPhone? What's the selling price in America? $499.50. What's the export price in China? $179.50. What's the value added in China? $6.50. It's not a China story, right? This is a story about a regional production system. Apple Computer, most of the gains in Apple are appropriated in design and branding by Apple in America. But I don't want to make this a story about China in particular. I want to talk about what happens in the world when we have a regional system of agglomeration. I'm going to come to the specific Japan story now. A regional system of agglomeration. Oh, I'm getting lost now, because I was stimulated by that point. Yeah. I'm going to pick up the commonalities. We're really at a win-win situation. Are we in a situation where China is moving forward very dramatically and other countries will fill its space? Which is really the story. And is there a dynamic in China, which we saw in Japan? When I was a child, it was always, cheap Japanese goods. Famous story my mother used to tell me about a South African retailer who sent a pair of shorts to Japan to get it copied. It was an old pair of shorts. There was a patch on the trousers. They bought 100,000 shorts in Japan. 100,000 shorts from Japan came back with a patch on it. Okay? Japanese got the best quality now is Japan. So you can construct a world of full employment where China vacates and Africa moves in. And you could well say, well, look, that's what's happening on the east coast of China. The shores of China, wages are going up. These firms are moving into higher and higher quality products. They're going to Vietnam, they're going to Indonesia, they're going into the interior, and China will become a rich country. You can construct a story like that. I don't believe it. Which is that I think there's an overhang there in those markets, in the Asian production system, and I think there are going to be poor people in China and in the world for many years to come. And my point about the Apple iPhone was that we mustn't demonize or magnify China. We have a productive capability out there in the world, which at the moment is primarily located in the China region, which fills that market space and market opportunity. And that market space and market opportunity will remain there. I still think that China will be in both segments of this market. Do you know the book by Zheng and Williamson? Which is something Dragon. Excellent book on 6 sectoral studies, how China's caught up and overtaken the West. You look at me. But that's only part of the Chinese system. There's an accumulating system out there which is still targeted on the lower and middle income. And these are the dynamic consumer markets. So in a way, the China story is a bit misleading, because it doesn't matter if it's China or India, or Brazil, or Mexico, or South Africa. The fact is somebody's jumping at that market space. Somebody's jumping at that market space. The final point is I believe that China is big enough to have both worlds, to have both that modern sector participating at the highest margins like Huawei in telecoms, and also the sorts of below-the-radar innovators I'm talking about. I suppose, I'm seeing some proper economists in the room in front of me, and I know that they're saying, well, this is not a world of win-lose. This is a world of win-win and specialization. And basically, as resources get more and more stretched, everybody will find a productive space to live in. And I'm just skeptical. I know I've done a lot of work in Africa, and Africa's opportunities for exports in North America and Europe are basically removed by Chinese and Bangladesh and Vietnamese garment producers. There's no space for African producers and manufacturers in the world. I'm sorry, we are diverted a bit. Ed, are you happy with my...
Well, not entirely. I agree with you with regard to Africa, but in regards to Africa, isn't not the problem that there is a problem in developing domestic demand and domestic articulation of markets in a very fundamental way, that you can't really learn about production unless you have an articulated domestic market in order to produce the kind of innovations that you're talking about.
But it is happening. The levels of professional capability in Africa are striking. On a separate project, we just did a study of backward linkages from the Nigerian oil industry. We were staggered at to what extent the construction and services and design knowledge-intensive service sector was basically filled by Nigerian professionals and Nigerian-owned firms. So you're beginning to see it all over. You look at South African telecoms firms in Africa, look at M-Pesa in Kenya. I should have put M-Pesa up. It's not just, you know, intelligent, hard-working Chinese people coming to Africa. It's happening in Africa as well. And it's happening because that's where the profits are. The profits are no longer located primarily and almost exclusively in high-income consumers. The dynamic markets are poor people. And greedy capitalists around the world, everywhere, want to take those market opportunities. They're indigenous in Africa. They're from China in Africa. They're China in China. It's just a different driver of demand. And that's why my side swipe at Rattan is that it's a driver of demand which you find very muted in the literature on technological, what's the word I'm searching for? The biases in technological change. You find it in Lancaster, you find it in Stewart's work, in the developing world at any rate, and it's just muted in the rest. And you find it in Mariana's work on the role of defense as a driver of demand. But in general, we don't think enough about that. Just a small point. German metalworking industries find Chinese component suppliers have fewer defects and higher quality than European suppliers.
My question has got to do with the relative level of how the different developing countries between themselves, the relationship is changing. So it's not about Africa and the impact of penetration of Chinese demand. But from a Latin American viewpoint, a bit more familiar with that, just 2 or 3 observations there. First of all, a lot of studies now found that growth in trade between Latin American countries is a higher value than growth in trade between China and Latin America. Very similar to what you said something there. So that increase in demand for commodities